What a rich and powerful text we've heard today. Thank you, Ken, for that wonderful presentation of the text, allowing this resurrection scene literally to come alive for us. Thank you so much for that. So in this text, we find Jesus finding the disciples in a similar way that he originally found the disciples, if you recall, fishing. The dramatic events of Holy Week now for these disciples on the water, these dramatic events of Holy Week are maybe in the rearview mirror. Expectations likely have been shattered. And memories of the past 3 years together with Jesus perhaps have been locked away. A way of coping, maybe. And the companions who had followed Jesus so diligently have now gone back to what they knew before, back to what was familiar, back to what was safe. And it is there that the resurrected Christ finds them once again. They had caught nothing. The stranger doesn't let them forget that. You have no fish, have you? No. Just no. Was it a no of disappointment? Was it a no of resignation? Was it just a matter of fact? No. Either way, it is a no that the stranger, Jesus, does not accept. Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And they did. And they did. So much so that they could not haul all the fish in initially. And suddenly, they knew. This was their Lord, their teacher, their companion, their friend. What was it that made that clear, do you think? That this was Jesus. Like other resurrection appearances in the Bible that we are familiar with, they don't seem to recognize him by his appearance. Now, we could unpack that for another sermon. But it doesn't even appear that they recognize him from his voice when he calls out. They don't seem to get it then either. But when he told them to cast their net on the right side, after they had fished all night on just the other side of the boat, catching nothing. And suddenly they had more fish than they could imagine. When their nets were filled beyond capacity, that's when they knew. That's when they knew who it was. Friends, that's when they knew it was resurrection. Because you see, resurrection is about abundance. An abundance of God's blessing, abundance of God's mercy, abundance of God's love and freedom and grace. And you know, I don't probably have to preach a whole lot about that to you guys. You probably wouldn't be here if you didn't know a little bit about the resurrection of abundance in your own life. Imagining where you have experienced, like Corellis talked to us last week, where God has been resurrected in our own lives, where we have known blessing beyond belief, where we have seen the unimaginable in our life. I dare say most of us in this worship experience would not be here if we didn't already know that to some degree. But I want us to challenge to think about this, that the abundance of resurrection is about more than just what we have known in our own lives. Because if we stop there in our own lives and in this story, I think we risk something pretty tragic. I think we risk some of the toxic evangelicalism that we experience in our world, the idea of sort of the prosperity gospel that, oh, if we find God, we can find abundance. And won't that feel good in our lives? But what I love so much about this lectionary text, that's pretty long, and in fact, I thought maybe we'll just like carve it down, just for time's sake. But when I really engaged this text, I realized that the resurrection abundance is also very much about the abundance of God's justice. And if we leave off the second part of that story that we heard today, we might actually miss that. You see, there is a wonderful miracle that happens as they cast their nets on the right side and they get more fish than they know what to do with. And it's beautiful and it's inspiring. But what happens after their nets are filled? Well, Jesus has this really interesting, I love the way you sat down, Ken, for this interesting conversation with his disciples, where he sits with them and he has a meal with them. And he says, hey, guess what? Why don't you bring some of those fish over here? Let's cook those and let's eat those together. And so their bellies were full. They were feeling good. And that is a part of this abundant story. But then the conversation turns and we focus on this always three parts, with Peter and Jesus, right? This three-part dialogue where Jesus asked Simon at the time, Simon Peter if he loves him. And Simon Peter says, of course I do. And Jesus says, then feed my lambs. And then he asked him again, you sure you love me? Commentary provided there, sorry. And Simon says, of course I do, of course. I mean, I know I did some stupid things back there, but yes, I do. And Jesus says, tend my sheep. And one more time, Jesus asked Simon Peter, do you love me? And by this point in time, Simon is exasperated, or it seems from the text. Yes, I love you. I do. Then a third time, Jesus says, feed my sheep. So it is important that we understand this text actually for what it is. It's about food, right? They were fishing, they caught some, they ate some, and then Jesus says, guess what? Go feed other people. And honestly, we could stop right there. It really is as simple as that. It's as simple as that. But if we stop in the first part, then we miss that the abundance of resurrection is about sharing that, about knowing it and letting it flow from us into the world around us. Some of you are probably familiar with the Poor People's Campaign. How many of you have heard of the Poor People's Campaign? So if whether you know about it or not, it originated by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the late 1960s, sort of on the tail end of Dr. King's civil rights work. And in fact, on the evening that he died, he was really in Memphis about the Poor People's Campaign, working with people of color as well as white people who were living in poverty and talking about tangible ways to move beyond that. And Dr. William Barber II has revived this and resurrected sort of this theme of the Poor People's Campaign. And a major tenet of this campaign is countering this idea, this lie that there is scarcity in the world, that there's not enough. Martin Luther King, in his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, says this: the contemporary tendency of our society is to base our distribution on scarcity and to compress our abundance into the overfed mouths of the middle and upper classes until they gag with superfluity. If democracy is to have breadth of meaning, it is necessary to adjust this inequity. It is not only moral, but it is also intelligent. We are wasting and degrading human life by clinging to archaic thinking. He says the curse of poverty has no justification in our age. Church, this is what I think this text is about. It is about countering this idea that there's not enough, because guess what? There is. Now, that doesn't mean to go about the world just taking freely. It is not about that, but there is enough. In this city where we have 60 to 70,000 people living in shelters or on the streets every night, guess what? There's enough housing. There is enough. On days when we have 200 plus people lined up in front of our building to get food, guess what? There is enough food. But like Dr. King says, we have stuffed it into the mouths of the rich and the powerful until they are gagging and we are gagging. Today, our Metro Moment was about our rooftop farm. And I know we missed a couple of things in that. I think the message really came through. The Hell's Kitchen Farm Project is rooted, pun intended, in a theology, ideology, and sociology of abundance. Some of you will remember the origin story that really 13 years ago, a network of food justice advocates in our area were lamenting that there was a lack. There is that word of scarcity, right? That there was a lack of fresh food options for low and middle income families in our city. Instead of living into the lie of scarcity, though, these folks, including some from our church and our nonprofit, started imagining a different reality. One where fresh, healthy food was actually available to anybody that needed it, anybody that wanted it. They started imagining a reality of abundance. And that imagination led to creativity and innovation and collaboration. They remembered the abundance of the earth and dreamed of growing their own food in the concrete jungle of New York City. Can you imagine? But how? How would we do this? How would this happen? Well, one said, I've heard that they're giving grants right now for urban agriculture projects. And then all of a sudden, another person in the room piped up and said, we just hired an intern that is a grant writer, and we don't have anything for them to do. And another person says, we have a member of our staff who's a trained farmer. And finally, we have a 4,000 square foot rooftop on our 100-year-old building that's not being used at all. Would that be helpful? It started with a seed. A shift from believing that there isn't enough, believing that there isn't a way, and then casting our nets on the other side. And that seed has grown to over 4,000 pounds of fresh vegetables from that rooftop that has been distributed through RMM's food pantry to thousands of people. That seed has grown into a place where more than food is grown on that rooftop, where community is made, where children and youth and adults learn, where laughter is heard, where respite is found, where there are long views, where nature coexists, even the pigeons, where imagination happens. It is where resurrection happens. And church, I want to say that that is not just a model for rooftop farms. That's a model for us and every part of our life and how we live in our work spaces, in our home spaces, in our community spaces, in our school spaces, how we relate to one another, how we walk down the street. We have to get beyond this lie of scarcity and move into a full theology of abundance that is so clear in this text and the way that Jesus lived his entire life. There's an organization called Living Cities. I've only recently learned about them, but they are a coalition of some pretty significant foundations throughout the world, really, that have decided to come together and to use their immense resources to really bring about change. And the way that they're doing it is inherently and moving away from the lie of scarcity. This is what they say. Shifting from scarcity to abundance mindset is the difference between assuming a fixed outcome and trusting that there are endless outcomes. An abundance mindset allows space for opportunities and scenarios that outweigh the limitations placed by fear. Having an abundant mindset is believing in all of life's possibilities. As part of our practice to disrupt white institutional culture, we are becoming more aware of the voice in our heads. It is telling us that there's only one way to achieve something, that there isn't enough, or that someone else's success, listen to this, will mean our failure. What? If so, how can we shift? How can we cast our nets, that's my addition to what they say, to the other side, to one of abundant thinking? During this time of turmoil, it's especially easy to fall into despair, into frustration and angst. The collision of multiple social crises has dramatically redefined what normal means for many of us. We may find ourselves feeling powerless, overwhelmed, terrified, and full of rage. But within every crisis, there are seeds of opportunity. Cultivating an abundant mindset is about nurturing those seeds to grow. So we have an opportunity. We had it on our roof, and church, we have it again, to think about how to move from a place of scarcity, of hoarding, of thinking about what can we hold on to, and to a place that could truly transform the world. I believe that. And it is the message that Jesus lived and resurrected. The really important piece of this text today for me are the very final words. As Jesus stood up at the end of his time together, he looked at Simon and probably at all of his disciples, and he said this. Do you remember? Follow me. Follow me. It's not just about observing the abundance of Christ, but it is about following in the steps, in receiving and distributing in the way that Jesus saw that economy. Church, when we follow Christ, then we witness to the resurrection that Jesus showed us. It is the resurrection to which we are to follow. Following Jesus down the path of abundance is an act of resistance to this present day, an age where for some reason we live into this idea that there's not enough for everyone. But following Jesus is that active resistance to a lie of scarcity that keeps us all, even if we're gagging on how much we have, it keeps us all in bondage. Following Jesus in the truth of abundance requires imagination, but we have it. Imagination to see a new way of living. And following Jesus in the truth of abundance requires shifting our nets, shifting our perspectives from a place of fear that promotes hoarding, self-centered self-preservation, and paranoia that someone is somehow going to get something over us, into a place that Jesus shows us that there is enough for us all. Sister Simone Campbell, some of you may be familiar with her. She's a religious sister, lawyer, longtime advocate, and famously one of the nuns on the bus from the movement in the sort of early 2010s. She says this, and these are our words that will send us forth. As Christians, we know, we experience, we live resurrection. And what the resurrection teaches us is that there is enough in the world to go around. If we share, sharing is at the heart of the Christian message. And it is at the heart of what will break open 21st century poverty so that we can live in a new way together. The abundance in our nation and abundance in our world, but we need to come at it not from an individualistic approach of how much do I have, but from the communal perspective of how do we flourish together? How do we flourish together? And I love what she says here in our closing time. This is going to take some missionary work. Some missionary work on our part. We are going to have to reach out and let others know. We have to be the voices, the prophetic voices of how abundant our world is if we step away from our fears. Because it's there that we can find joy and hope and enough. And that is the message of resurrection. May it be so.